What's up, guys? This is Coach Bourne, your world history teacher. And what we're going to do for this week is, specifically today, I will probably post 2 to 3 video lessons that are not live. They're recorded probably 2 or 3 times a week. And I'll have a sheet for you to fill out that will go directly with the notes that I'm giving you on these recorded sessions. And you'll have to fill out those sheets of information based on what I'm giving you through these video presentations. And so this first one, and obviously this being the first week, I want to introduce to you guys the units that we're going to be doing throughout the whole year. And then I want to talk about how to read a timeline, which is pretty easy, but it can be pretty confusing because of the BC and the AD part of the timeline. So the first part, the first thing that I want to do today is talk to you about the units that we will cover over the next 36 weeks in our class. So with the sheet that you'll have in modules, which will go with these notes, so the dates will match up. What it will say is World History video notes, Monday, August 24th, and then it'll have the video itself for August 24th. So you'll always match up the information that you have to write down on the notes with the video presentation. So I'll have it all arranged for you so you really can't mess it up. And I'll try to keep it very organized for you. But today, what I want to do is go through just a very brief talk about the units that we're going to do over the next 36 weeks in our class. And so if you haven't already, make sure you go ahead and click on the information sheet that you're going to have to fill out for me. And then what I'm about to tell you will directly coincide with that sheet. And so you'll write down the units that I'm about to tell you in the blanks that are on that sheet so that you can get a good overview of what we're going to cover over the next year. And so the first unit that we will talk about is called the Neolithic Revolution. It's Neolithic. Had to make sure I spelt it correctly. The second unit that we will cover is river civilization. So we'll go over the civilizations that popped up obviously on rivers because that supplied water, food, and transportation for our early civilizations in the world. The third unit that we'll talk about is religions. So you can write down in the third blank, world religions. The fourth unit we'll talk about is the Greeks, Greeks. The next unit that we'll talk about is the Romans, followed by the Byzantine Empire, very quick unit. That one's pretty short. Followed by the Middle Ages, followed by the Renaissance and Reformation. Renaissance is spelled Renaissance, Renaissance, the Renaissance and the Reformation, that goes together, Renaissance and Reformation. Reformation is spelled Reformation, Reformation. Followed by one of my favorite, the Age of Discovery. So lots of science in this one. Followed by the French Revolution. So that one gets pretty interesting with the guillotine and a little overboard scared action by the French. Followed by World War I. Followed by World War II. Followed by the Cold War. COLD, the Cold War. And then the last unit in our class will be called the Postmodern Era. The Postmodern Era. And I know I talk fast sometimes because I'm very ADD, which I told you guys in the first Teams meeting that we had, if you were part of that. But that's why it's on video. You can always go back, rewind, and catch up in case I'm going too fast. So again, the units, the Neolithic Revolution, river civilizations, world religions, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantine Empire, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and the Reformation, that's together, the Age of Discovery, the French Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and then the final unit in our class, which will be the last couple of weeks in our school year, is the Postmodern Revolution. And so if you'll fill those in on the sheet that I prepared for you guys. The next thing that I want to talk to you guys about is the difference between primary and secondary sources. So in this class, we'll obviously be looking at some books and textbooks because that's history. And what you're going to need to make sure you know is, are we looking at a primary source or are we looking at a secondary source? And the definition of that is pretty simple, and that you do want to write this down on the sheet that I prepared for you. A primary source means there was an eyewitness account. So there was an eyewitness that was there, they saw it, they wrote it down. And that's a simple definition of a primary source. They were there, they were an eyewitness, they saw it, and they wrote down the information or recorded it. And then the other type of source is a secondary source. And a secondary source means they were not eyewitnesses, that they have written down information based on other people's accounts or other sources. So a secondary source is information that we get based on a variety of sources that were not eyewitnesses. And some examples of that could be Wikipedia, even textbooks. Most textbooks are simply secondary sources because they weren't there. So write that down. For primary source, eyewitness account. For secondary source, a variety of sources have been used that were not eyewitnesses. And then when it comes to reading the timeline, if you look at a timeline, it gets a little confusing because 0 on the timeline is the birth of Christ. And anything before 0 we call BC, or before Christ. Anything after 0 we call AD, or Anno Domini. And on a timeline where it gets confusing is if we look at something that's before 0, let's say it happened 20 BC, because BC is before 0, and it ended 20 AD, so after 0, what do you do there to get the time and the time difference? If I were to ever ask you how long did something occur, and it crosses the birth of Christ. And so what I would like you to write down on your sheet is, number one, if it's before 0, number one, write down that 0 is the birth of Christ. And then number two, if it's before 0, we call that BC, before Christ. If it's after 0, we call that AD, or Anno Domini. And then, so write those three things down. And then the next thing that I want to teach you or tell you about, just to make sure that you know, most of you already know this, and that is, if the time period that we're talking about is on the left side of 0, that would be the BC side, and it's all on the BC side, then you always subtract the difference. So for instance, if something happened, 20,000 BC to 10,000 BC, what's the time difference? Well, you would subtract 10,000 from 20,000 to get 10,000 years of difference. And so it gets confusing sometimes because you don't know whether to add or subtract to get the time length of a time period that we're talking about. And so it's pretty easy. If it's all on one side, like it's all on the left side, which is the BC side, you always subtract. If it's all on the right side, which is the AD side, then you always subtract. For instance, if you want to know the difference between, or the time period between, 2000 and 2020, which we're in right now, the time difference would be 20 years. You would subtract 2000 from 2020, and you would get 20 years. So what happens if it crosses 0? For instance, I wanted to know the time difference between 100 BC to 100 AD. You wouldn't subtract. In that particular instance, if the time periods that we're talking about cross 0, in other words, they're both on the left and the right side of 0, both the BC and the AD side of 0, that's when you add, and it's the only time that you add. So if I asked you, what's the time difference between or the amount of time that went by between 100 BC and 100 AD, well, it crossed 0, so you add 100 plus 100, and your answer is 200 years. So if I ask you how many years between 100 BC and 100 AD, add 100 plus 100, and you get 200. And so the answer is 200 years. Whereas if it's all on the left side, the BC side, and I say, how many years went by between 10,000 BC and 9,000 BC, since that's on the same side, it never crossed 0, you would subtract 9,000 from 10,000, and the answer is 1,000 years difference. And the same would occur if it was all on the AD side. And that gets a little confusing at times. So the main thing is to be able to read a timeline and to know that 0 is the birth of Christ. Anything before 0, that's the left side of 0. That's BC, before Christ. And anything right of 0 is AD, which is after the birth of Christ, and it stands for Anno Domini. So just make sure we know how to use and read a timeline, because that's obviously important in history, because everything's dictated by time and a date. And so that's kind of how we use a timeline in world history. And then I've got some questions on your sheet there that you need to look at and answer and see if you can get them right. And then the last thing that I would teach you on the video is time itself. We measure history in what's called centuries, which you guys probably already know. And so on your sheet, make sure you know what a century is. A century is 100 years. Write that down. And then the first century would be from day 1 to day 100 in time, or any time for that matter. So it gets confusing, because 1 to 100 would be the first century. And then, of course, 101 to 200 would be the second century. 201 to 300 would be the third century. And 301 to 400 would be the fourth century, and 401 to 500 would be the fifth century, which is a little confusing, because when you think 401 to 500, 500, that's the fifth century. That's not true. 401 to 500 is the fifth century. 501 to 600 is the sixth century. And so there's a couple questions there just to make sure that you understand how to do a century, and what centuries are correspond with what we're in, and for instance, like where we're at today. And so that's just a very quick 12-minute lesson today on what we're covering this year, how to read a timeline, BC versus 0 versus AD, and then what is a century, and then how do you read centuries. So complete the sheet that I gave you, submit that to me. Camera just fell, but submit that to me, and that'll be really your only work for Monday, Tuesday. So Monday, Tuesday, that's today and tomorrow. The main thing that I'll have you guys do is listen to this 12 to 13 minute lesson on the units, the timeline, and the centuries, and then you'll be done. But and then I'll see you guys next Monday on our live Teams meeting. We're going to meet today here, actually, in a couple of minutes on our live team meeting, and then next Monday. Don't forget, we'll meet every Monday live on Teams meeting, as long as we have remote learning or distance learning that's going on. So you guys have a great day.